Hi there and welcome back. I hope you're having a good day. This is Jennifer McGuire, and today I have a fun and unique watercolor technique. Now, I have said many times I am not that great at watercolor, but I love to use it, especially when there's a fun technique that I get to use with it to make it extra cool. Well, today's technique involves using watercolor with rubbing alcohol to create some fun backgrounds. It works great for clouds, night skies, or snowy skies, although it can be used for many other things. I have several card examples for you today, including one with a really fun pop-up design inside that I think you'll love. The best part about this technique is that you can use it with a variety of watercolors and inks, so you can try out what you have. Now, I'm going to start by doing examples where I create a soft look, like a soft snowy sky. Then I will move into a cloud technique that I absolutely love. Okay, so I have some Tim Holtz watercolor paper that I'm taping to my desk so that it doesn't curl while we add water. Any watercolor paper will work. I just like this particular one because it's bright white. Next, I'm getting out some watercolor to use. This is Winsor Newton watercolor. I will be honest, I've never used it because I'm afraid of watercolor that comes in these little bottles because I don't feel I'm good enough at watercolor to use this fancy stuff, but I figure I might as well break it out and try it. So all I'm doing here is putting a very light blue wash of color over the entire piece. You want to be pretty generous with water here because it does work better if you have a wet watercolor piece, not a dry one. I add a little extra water there. Okay, so now I have some rubbing alcohol that I'm dipping a little paintbrush into, and I'm flicking it on to the wet watercolor. Now this will be very subtle since I'm starting with a light color. I'll show you how it's more dramatic on a darker paint background. But this is wet, flicking a little bit of rubbing alcohol on it, drying it just a bit, then I'm going to flick some more on. What happens is the rubbing alcohol repels the water and leaves these white spots. It's more intense than you would get if you flicked water onto watercolor when it's dry. I like the look of the rubbing alcohol because it really does leave a nice white spot behind. Again, these are very subtle examples because I wanted a soft blue sky with the little snow falling, but you can get intense results. Here are a few other backgrounds I made in a similar way. Some I did with other forms of watercolor. This one I actually did with distress ink. So you can use distress ink and water to create a watercolor background. While it's wet, you can flick on the rubbing alcohol. And different watercolors will give you different effects. On these, I didn't use much rubbing alcohol at all. Here's one where I did bigger splatters of the rubbing alcohol so you can get a better idea of how much it lightens that area and repels the watercolor that is on the paper. Again, you want to make sure you apply the rubbing alcohol to a wet background. Okay, let's do one that's a little more intense. So I am wetting my paper and adding some blue watercolor here. Try any watercolor you may have. Distress inks works great too. I'm putting down a pretty generous bit of blue watercolor that's nice and wet. Then I will come in with my rubbing alcohol, dip a brush into it, and then flick it on to that wet paper. You'll immediately see how the rubbing alcohol creates white spots because it repels that paint and almost makes it dry immediately in those spots. I think this would work really well for a night sky look. Just put down dark purple and dark blue and black watercolor, and while it's still wet, splatter some alcohol on it, and you'll have the perfect skies. And it doesn't take much effort at all, and rubbing alcohol is something that many of us have on hand. If you want smaller dots, you can use an old toothbrush and dip that in the rubbing alcohol, and then rub your finger against the bristles, and it puts down tiny little dots of the alcohol. And by the way, by heat setting it just a little bit in between each application of rubbing alcohol, my later dots end up being a soft blue instead of a white. So that's a way to get a little bit of a variation in your background. Next, I wanted to show how to do a cloud background. I can't paint to save my life, but this makes creating a cloud background so easy. This time I decided to show a different watercolor. This is Hero Art's liquid watercolor. Just try whatever you have. I'm putting down a pretty generously wet background with this color. And then I'm coming in with a brush and rubbing alcohol and just dabbing against that wet background. Where I put down that rubbing alcohol, you'll see that area turns white and kind of repels the color away. And you easily get these beautiful looking clouds. Again, all I'm doing is dipping my brush into the rubbing alcohol and just dabbing it in little spots close together. I really like the soft look that you get with this. It's kind of subtle, and so it doesn't distract from anything we put in the front of it, but it does give that sky look. You can go back and keep adding more, but once your background is dry, the alcohol won't affect the watercolor much at all. Okay, so after I heat set this, I can add that to a card. And remember, all of these backgrounds look much better when you trim them down to put on a card. So if you aren't sure that you're happy with your results at first, trim it down and see, you might like it. I will have one more example of using watercolor and rubbing alcohol at the end of this video. But first, let's make cards with the backgrounds that I've already created. Let's start with the cloud background with this cute little snowman. Wanted to show you a few little tricks that I did with this one. I'm using the Essentials by Ellen Snow Buds stamp set. This has all the little pieces that you could need to create different types of snowmen. There are different expressions to put on their face, different scarves, mittens, different hats, and you can even make it so he's juggling. You can see the little circle stamps there on the bottom. But I'm going to change that up a little bit here. I'm also using the coordinating dies, so I'm not actually going to stamp the snowman. Instead, I'm going to die cut him and add the stamp accents to it. I die cut 3 snowmen and glued them together for a little bit of dimension. Next, I'm going to use the little expression stamp to stamp one of the faces onto him. I like that you can change them out and do different faces, so you can actually have a family of snowmen and they all look a little different. So next I'm adding the little arms. I could have stamped the arms with the stamp included in the set, but instead I just decided to use my Copic marker just to draw little stick arms and also color in his nose. Then I'm using a very light pool colored Copic. This is BG10, and I'm just pulling the color along the bottom just to give a little bit of a shadow look there. Little touches like this make a big difference in the end and are very easy to do. I also die cut a scarf and colored that with Copic markers, and I'm gluing that onto my snowman along with the arms. I wanted to create a white snowbank for him to sit on, so I die cut a large circle from a piece of scrap white cardstock, and I'm gluing it right onto the bottom of my sky circle. Once I have that glued there, I can flip it over and cut the excess away, and I have a nice little snowy hill that our snowman can sit on. And you can see now that I've cut that cloud background down to a circle, it looks so much better than that messy look that we had earlier. Okay, so I white heat embossed a sentiment that says Snow What Fun, and that is from that same Essentials by Ellen set I showed you earlier. And now I'm using liquid adhesive to add little white pom-poms to make it look like he's juggling some snowballs. If you don't have white pom-poms, you could use the stamps or die cuts included in the set. I use my Tonic Aqua Shimmer pen to add some sparkle or shimmer to the snowman and the snowbank. I almost feel like that's necessary when you have snow because it really catches the eye on that simple white cardstock. Then I added some blue Nuvo drops very carefully to be the little buttons on the snowman. You could also use gems there if you wanted. Now for the background, I did a subtle tone-on-tone look. I die cut a bunch of snowflakes, and I'll show you those dies a little bit later. And then I glued them onto a note card of the same color and trimmed off the excess. I then matted our snowman piece onto a larger white circle and glued that in the center. So this shows you how you can use watercolor and rubbing alcohol to create a soft cloud background. Okay, next let's create a card using one of those soft snowy sky backgrounds that we created. Now this one's very simple on the front, but what's fun about this card is when you open it up, it has a fun pop-up surprise. So those hearts and snowflakes all pop up, and it's a really fun effect. To create this, I used the new Essentials by Ellen pop-up mittens die set. So there are mittens and snowflakes in here. Those are the snowflakes I used on the last card's background. And you can make those mittens or snowflakes pop up, but I'm going to change it up a bit. See that funny rectangle die there at the top? That's what you use to create that pop-up effect, which you can use with a lot of different dies. I'm also using the Essentials by Ellen Snowy Days stamp set. You can use those decorative stamps on the bottom to stamp on those mittens, which I decided not to use in this video, but I did use the Happy Winter sentiment on the front of my card. Let's start with the inside of the card. I die cut a large heart from one of those snowy sky backgrounds that we created, and I put a score line right down the center to fold it perfectly in half. Next, I have the 2 die cut pop-up pieces. These have score lines so that you can fold them each along those score lines. Then the 2 ends will overlap and you glue those together with either a strong liquid adhesive or with some sort of strong tape. You'll have 2 of these that you'll put together in the same way, and they both end up looking like open cubes when you're done. You'll need 2 of them for each pop-up. I have my open card here, and we're going to glue these 2 cubes together right up against the crease of the card. So I put glue on one side of my cube, and I'm gluing it on one side of the card right up against the crease. I will put glue on the side of that cube and glue on the bottom of the other cube and glue those up together on the other side of the crease. So those cubes are glued together and glued to the card with the crease between them. I'm going to have to hold this here while it dries. I probably should have used a tape instead, but this worked out okay. Once it's dry, I can fold my card and you can see how it pops open. And you have those 2 cubes glued together and they flatten when you close the card. So now I'm going to glue my heart onto the top of that. That way, when you open the card, the heart will pop up. So you can really glue any die cut onto this that you want. You just need to fold the die cut right down the center. So I'm putting the heart onto it to make sure that the crease of the heart lines up with where those 2 cubes meet. Once that dries, you'll see how that large heart pops up nicely when you open the card. Next, I die cut a smaller white heart and stamped a sentiment on it and scored it right down the middle. We're going to put that on top of the big heart so it pops up too. But first, I want to add some snowflakes. So I had some extra silver die cut snowflakes that I'm gluing onto the heart so that when we open the card, the snowflakes pop up also. Okay, so now I have 2 more cubes that I made, just like before. I'm going to glue that on top of the heart right up against the crease on the left. I'll put some glue on the side of it, and I have another cube. I'll put glue on the bottom of it, put that right up against the other cube on the other side of the crease. And we have another pop-up feature. So this is a double pop-up coming up from the center. You could do just one if you wanted to. And I'll put our folded heart on top of that. So on the front of the card, I'm going to skip showing it because it's really easy. I just die cut my snowy sky background from a stitch rectangle die and added it to a card along with a bunch of silver glitter snowflakes from that mitten pop-up die set I showed you. I also added some silver gems and a Happy Winter sentiment. Now when you open up the card is where all the fun is. It's where you have those pop-up hearts, the pop-up greeting, and those snowflakes. And you can see there's plenty of room around it to write any message that you want. I think it'd be fun to have a pop-up photo in a card or any kind of stamped image. And you can see that these pop-up dies work with the mittens or the snowflakes or any other shape that you may have. So this example just shows another way you can use those snowy sky backgrounds. And I used it on the inside and the outside of the card, so it kind of pulled everything together nicely. Okay, let's create another example with the snowy sky before we move on to a different technique. Now for this one, I decided to add some die cutting to the snowy sky, just for a little bit of dimension. This card is actually quite simple. Thanks to that snowy sky background, it still has a lot of interest to it. So I have the Essentials by Ellen Snowfall background die. I'll hold my watercolor piece up against it, run it through my die cut machine, and I end up with all these snowy dots. I'm also using the Essentials by Ellen Mountain Holiday stamp set. I stamped 2 skiers in a mountain, colored them, and cut them out with the coordinating dies. After I popped out all of those holes on that background, I glued it onto a top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, using foam tape so it has some dimension. Now I have some white cardstock that I'm gluing right on top of that and trimming off the side and the bottom. So I have kind of a ski slope on the front of my card. I then will do the same thing on the other side on the bottom of the card for a ski slope going in the other direction. I find it easier just to glue it down like this and then trim off the excess. Okay, so I can go ahead and add my little mountain and my little skiers to this. And then I will also add a sentiment to the bottom. This sentiment is from that snowman stamp set that I used earlier in this video. Here you can see that snowy sky background, very subtle, and how I added dimension to it by using that Snowfall background die and adding it to my card with foam adhesive so you can kind of see through them and you get that look of dimension. I also use foam tape to add the skiers so they pop out too. Okay, now for another way to do that rubbing alcohol with watercolor background. This time I have a 1-layer watercolor piece where I did watercoloring in the center and then that technique around it. For this, I used the Essentials by Ellen Mondo Holly stamp set. This one's been on my desk for a while and I've really wanted to use it. I'm not great at watercolor, but I did try my best. I heat embossed it with black embossing powder on watercolor paper and then colored it in with green and red watercolor. It's not the best, but it does work. But what I want to do is around this do a snowy sky with that blue watercolor and rubbing alcohol. But I don't want to mess up the watercolor on the holly. I don't want the alcohol to hit that. So here's what I'm doing. I'm putting down a very wet wash of blue watercolor. Then I'll use a cloth to kind of cover up my holly as I'm going, and then I will flick on some rubbing alcohol. Now you really don't have to cover it up perfectly or even take the time to create a mask. The reason is the rubbing alcohol doesn't really affect the dried watercolor. All that holly is dried watercolor. So when I flick alcohol on it, it doesn't really do anything. You need to use it on wet watercolor, like I am here with the blue. So I really don't have to cover up the holly too much. However, if you get watercolor drops onto your watercolor paper where there isn't watercolor, it'll dry, and then when you put watercolor on top of it, you'll be able to see those spots. They'll be a little darker there. That's a really cool effect, and you could do that for another card or another technique. But in this case, I only wanted those light white spots that I get when I apply the alcohol to the wet watercolor. So that's why I kind of covered up the unwet areas of my background with the cloth. Okay, for a sentiment, I used this piece die from the Altenew Peaceful Wreaths die set. It's actually from the die set that coordinates with this stamp set. I also white heat embossed on a vellum strip the words "On Earth" from this Honeybee Rejoice stamp set. I glued the piece die cut onto that vellum strip and added it to the card, and then also put 2 very thin strips of white cardstock on both sides of the vellum just for a finishing touch. So you can see how I have that okay red and green watercolor on my holly, but around it I have that snowy sky that I created with the soft blue watercolor and the alcohol that I kind of flicked over it. So there are many ways you can do this technique, and remember, if you use darker colors, the results are more intense. I hope you'll give this a try, especially that cloud background. I really think it's a fun way to use your watercolors. If you're interested in the supplies, they are linked below in my YouTube description. And in the center here, I have a couple other watercolor technique videos that I think you might like. They really are effortless for those of you like me who struggle with watercolor. Thanks for taking the time to be here with me today, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a great week.